Hello and welcome to the latest episode of The Best Time to Plant a Tree, the podcast recorded by me, David Spears, South Australia's Minister for Environment and Water. In our first outdoor recorded podcast, we go to Kangaroo Island, where I get out on a private conservation park with Tim Allard, the Chief Executive of the Australian Wildlife Conservancy, also known as AWC. We talk about Tim, his career, his relative recent arrival in the world of conservation, and explore a great project based on Kangaroo Island where AWC is working with private landowners to restore the bushfire devastated environment. It's a great podcast, it's outdoor, you get to hear some birdsong overhead. I'm sure you'll enjoy it and learn lots about the Australian Wildlife Conservancy. Welcome to another edition of The Best Time to Plant a Tree, the podcast hosted by me, David Spears, South Australia's Minister for Environment and Water. And today, something a little bit different. This is going to be an outdoor podcast. It's only the third podcast that I've ever recorded, and the first one I've done outdoors, so we'll see how it goes. And also a little bit different because most of our guests that I'm going to be interviewing as part of this podcast are going to be people working in South Australia's environment who are from South Australia. But today is a little bit different. I am interviewing Tim Allard, the Chief Executive of the Australian Wildlife Conservancy, who is from Victoria but based in Western Australia. Tim, welcome to the great outdoors in South Australia. It's good to have you on the podcast.
Thank you very much, and really appreciate being involved in the podcast.
Thank you. Well, we hope there's lots of listeners. We don't know how many there'll be, but we hope there's lots of listeners. My mum will listen, and if you pass it on to your family and friends, Tim, hopefully there'll be a few more. But who knows? Anyway, today's podcast is probably going to be a little bit shorter. We are outdoors. We're on Kangaroo Island. We're in the Western River Refuge, which is an Australian Wildlife Conservancy initiative in partnership with a range of other partners, but we'll get to that in a few minutes. Firstly, I just want to talk about you, Tim, and you didn't have a background in conservation necessarily before getting this job, but do you want to tell me just very briefly how you ended up as the Chief Executive of AWC?
My story of how I came to be in this position is long and convoluted, and I'll try and be succinct. I grew up in eastern Victoria, and those people might remember during the height of the 2019-20 bushfires, a place called Malakuta in the far east Gippsland, where people were evacuated by the Navy when the fires were at their peak. That's where I grew up. That's where my dad still lives. When I grew up there, we had a small cattle farm, and back in the late 70s and early 80s, showing my vintage, my dad was actually a parks ranger for about 8-9 years. Yeah. And I remember sitting around the dinner table, and Dad would have rangers over for dinner, and they were talking about the long-footed potoroo. And I would have been 7, 8, 9 years old, and I had no idea what a potoroo was, let alone what a long-footed potoroo was or even looked like. And even at that young age, I think it stuck with me a little bit as to what on earth was this creature that they were talking about. And at the time, there was a little bit of publicity around the numbat. And I remember looking at this creature, I just was puzzled as to why I didn't know about these Australian native species. Anyway, from there, I joined the Navy and spent a decade in the Navy, as you do, and then moved to Western Australia and started working through the construction, mining and oil and gas sectors. That was in the early 2000s when the boom was taking off in the resources sector. And I did that for a range of years, and my last role before coming to AWC was running an engineering company. And I woke up one day, it sounds overnightish, but I came to the realisation that I developed skills in running businesses, operational skills, and I thought, well, I can keep doing this for another 20 to 30 years before I retire, working for resources extractive industries, or I can find something to give back. And I wasn't quite sure what that meant and what I was going to achieve, but I started looking around, And lo and behold, Australian Wildlife Conservancy were advertising for their National Operations Manager. I thought, look, I'm not a conservationist, but I'll put my CV in. And next thing I know, I was being interviewed by Martin Copley, the founder of AWC, and we're chatting about what it needed to run AWC and how he was trying to frame the organisation of not being a charity, not being a not-for-profit, but being a business-like operation, very focused on delivering outcomes. And it just resonated. The ability to work at scale across the country, being very outcomes-focused, very mission-orientated into conservation outcomes, it was like hand and...
Yeah, just a great opportunity for you to grab hold of.
Yeah.
And I do want to say to our listeners, if you hear the bird song here, this is not being laid over the podcast with some sort of sound effect. We're actually, I think it's honey eaters out here. And it's a great place for us to be doing this podcast today. So you got to AWC, a organisation which is getting land into the conservation reserve system, but often privately owned or owned by AWC, not necessarily government owned like so many of our parks are in the state. And as Environment Minister, we can go some way with government owned reserves, but often and importantly, the vast majority of land in this nation is privately owned. So we need private landowners to be thinking with a conservation mindset, and having NGOs coming along and being willing also to purchase properties to bring into the broader reserve system and create those connected corridors across our vast nation. AWC is in the business of owning land. What sort of land holdings do you have across Australia?
So it's vast, in whichever way you look at it. So at the moment we're working across some 6.5 million hectares across Australia, through Western Australia, Northern Territory, Queensland, New South Wales. And here in South Australia, in fact, our largest private reserve, Kalamurna Wildlife Sanctuary, 660,000 hectares on the north shore of Lake Eyre. So it's considerable. And I tend to talk about AWC in the decades. So this year is our 30-year anniversary.
So you haven't been around for that long when you think about it, considering the amount of land that's now under your care and control.
That's right. It's been a rapid growth. Martin Copley, when he founded AWC, started with Karakamai Wildlife Sanctuary, just on the outskirts of Perth. And Karakamai is actually one of the local, it's a derivative of a local Noongar name for the black cockatoos.
Okay.
And so Karakamai is 275 hectares. And in comparison, or relative to where AWC is today, it's a very small property, but it's a very important one where just on the outskirts of a major city, you can go and see woylies, Tamar wallabies, where it's almost impossible to see these animals in the wild now. They're being decimated by feral cats. So in that first growth period of AWC in the first 2 decades, it was growth through acquisition, purchasing large cattle stations. Mount Gibson in the midwest of Western Australia of 130,000 hectares. Then to the Kimberley with Mornington Wildlife Sanctuary and others. And in the Kimberley alone, we work now across about 4 million hectares alone. And then it really was across the north of the country. But then we reached a point where the cost of land was starting to increase. There was a lot of economic activity with cattle production, so the cost of land started to increase and made it very difficult. So to make sure we're following our mission of effective conservation of all Australian native animals, we need to identify alternate ways to get land access. And we do that through partnerships. We've formed partnerships with Department of Defence in the Kimberley on one of their very large training areas. New South Wales National Parks, and we've contracted to work with them to manage 2 national parks and build large fenced areas in New South Wales. Working with pastoralists, and we've got a pastoral partnership in the Northern Territory where it's a commercial cattle operation and we're managing conservation at the same time. And we're working with private landholders like the Dobe family here on Kangaroo Island. And it's really about identifying what are the conservation priorities in Australia. And particularly from an AWC perspective, we tend to be focused on threatened species and what we can do to intervene and secure their future. Where Australia is now from a conservation point of view is not in a good state. If you look at the research species are still in decline, and the rate of decline on threatened species is actually increasing. Things are getting worse. We're at that point now in Australia, we're at a tipping point where we need to unlock the model to implement effective conservation outcomes at scale. And that's where you have private organisations, government, private landholders, all coming together to unlock effective conservation opportunities at scale right across the country.
Linking up various reserves of different tenures, but with a similar mindset
That's
and a
right.
similar purpose. So before we come to talk about the Kangaroo Island project and the model you've got here at Western River Refuge, when AWC comes to a property, whether that was one of those big pastoral properties that you took care and control of when you first got established 30 odd years ago, or more in a more timely sense, the properties that you partner alongside private owners with, what do you do? How do you go in there and obviously you assess what's there? Do you put in a plan in place, an improvement plan? In some cases you obviously undertake fencing projects to keep out the feral predators. Obviously it's different for every project, but do you sort of have a general model as to your approach?
Yeah, so the secret to AWC's success is people on the ground, in the field, delivering science-informed land management. And fundamentally, we are a science-based organisation. So about a third of our workforce are ecologists, and 20 of those have their PhD. When we approach a brand new property, in fact, stepping back from there, we have a map of the country that we've undertaken some mapping, identifying where the most species have been lost. So we identify whether we can go and do work to reintroduce species through the use of fenced areas or similar, or where we can manage the landscape of extant populations of threatened species. And the Kimberley is a good example. In the Kimberley, the far northwest coast, it's one of the few places in Australia that's not suffered any mammal extinctions since European arrival. So it's a really important place to protect. So we implement science-informed land management, fire management in particular, to make sure we're providing refuge and helping to mitigate against the impact of feral cats. In the south of the country, where it's more difficult to do landscape management, we tend to construct large-scale fenced areas. And so we're using science, evidence, data and knowledge, knowledge from our Indigenous partners in particular, to help inform that enduring, ongoing land management programs.
The fencing side of things, early fencing projects tended to come up against problems of interbreeding of species and then overabundance in particular intense geographical areas. How do you overcome that? Is it a matter of scale, or is it by translocating species at certain times, keeping really good data on what's in there and what you need to bring in and take back out again? What's your approach there?
It's actually a really good question, and a very important question, that often when people talk about fenced area projects, the big sexy thing, the big visual thing is the fence that's been built, and everybody looks at the fence.
People love them. They think that's a great thing, but it's a lot more difficult than just firing up a fence.
That's right. Yeah, and the fence is good in of itself, but it is part of the project. And really the most complicated and difficult piece is the ongoing management of the project. You then immediately switch into the eradication of feral predators, feral herbivores. But then the expertise and the value is the ecological management within that fenced area. So undertaking enduring monitoring programs of the species within it, as you said, managing and measuring the genetic diversity, and that's becoming a more critical piece, particularly as broader populations of species start to decline.
Yes.
There's a species called the woylie, or the brush-tailed bettong. It's really only persisting now behind fenced areas. There's a small population in the southwest of Western Australia. And so we must manage the genetic diversity, otherwise we're going to give ourselves problems over the next 5, 10, 15 years. So we're starting to think about meta-population management, thinking about managing national populations of these species. So where we have them in our fenced area network or with other partners, starting to move animals around, so we're making sure we have the genetic diversity for the health of the species into the future. And that's really where the value and the importance of these projects is managing it, not just in isolation. It's not just a project. You're thinking about this at a meta-population level. You're thinking about at a national level on the health of a population.
And so that's where you really do have to invest in the science and the data collection and get the ecological experts in. And you mentioned your workforce is about a third are ecologists, and 20 of those have a PhD. How big is your workforce in AWC, and how we've got the ecologists, but how's it broken down in other ways?
Yeah, so ultimately we're a science-informed land management organisation. So we use science and collect data to use to inform our land management programs. So we have, given what time, depending on the time of the year, and our busiest time is during the dry season in the north when we employ a lot of seasonal workers. We peak around 220 headcount is what we'd employ. A third of the workforce being ecology. The biggest chunk of our team is the land management team. So we have sanctuary managers, so the people that look after the properties on the ground, land management staff, and they're the ones out there doing the fire management, the feral animal control, the weed management, maintaining building fences, infrastructure, water, all the things that need to make a sanctuary operate in remote parts of Australia.
They're taking the role of a ranger in many ways.
Essentially. And one of the keys to AWC's model is that these properties have people living on them. So they're not living in town, going out onto the properties. Where possible, people live on property. And so they're getting to know, love, and understand the natural cycles and rhythms of the part of the land they're on.
Yes. One matter which is quite controversial is in the conservation arena is the use of fire in the landscape. And we are standing on the western end of Kangaroo Island, and I flew over this property on the 5th of January 2020, and we are in one of the few green patches that were left behind after the devastating bushfires on Kangaroo Island, and we are standing here right at the moment in one of those green patches. There is increasing support and interest in the use of fire for ecological purposes, but also for land management across Australia, and particularly in southern Australia, where it is difficult to use fire because there's large populations of people combined with fragmented populations of rare species, which can of course be as negatively impacted by fire as they can be positively. AWC uses fire in the landscapes that they manage. What's your experience of it and your organisation's approach to the use of fire?
Our starting point is that fire is a fundamental part of the Australian landscape. So you ignore fire or don't use fire at your peril. So it's about understanding the correct way to implement fire. And we know that the Indigenous peoples have been using fire in the landscape to manage the bush for tens of thousands of years. It's a part of the natural cycle of Australia. And even without people, lightning played a significant part. So we have to understand that fire is a part of the landscape. The ecology has evolved to adapt to fire. Many of the species from a mammal, flora and fauna, have evolved to adapt, utilise and work with fire cycles. The way that seeds germinate from various vegetation types, to how birds might use that, to when the bird types are around, to how they disperse the seeds through the bush. Fire is really one of the fundamental tools to successful land management, and particularly successful land management at scale. Where we are now in Australia's modern history is we need to understand that we have a growing population. People are moving out and becoming closer to the bush. So we can't just manage purely from an ecological point of view. We have to manage fire considering the risk to life and property and infrastructure. We have to manage fire to take into account the ecology needs. So all those need to be built together to understand how to best use fire to protect, to manage the bush, to manage the land, and to protect communities into the future. A lot of the fire we do in the north, we're in a position where we can do massive fires, and they can burn for a week, and they'll trickle out when they run into a creek or a gorge or something to that effect. In the south of the country, it's much more difficult, where you're working in peri-urban, urban environments, and it's still important to do fire. If we don't manage fuel loads, we're going to run into a big bushfire risk, and that came out through the 1920 summer season. But there's a balance between burning just for fuel load reduction and understand the ecological impacts of not using fire in the right way, or eliminating fire in its entirety. So it's coming back to science and the expertise of the people that are involved in fire. And one of the downsides of the 2019 bushfires, and there was many significant downsides, but a lot of experts popped up overnight.
Yes. Oh, well, welcome to the world of the Environment Minister. Yes, I hear from them all, and all their friends as well.
And it's important to, that we as leaders in the conservation sector need to understand how important fire is, and then we need to use experts that's using evidence, data and knowledge to inform those programs.
So our discussion on fire is a good segue to Kangaroo Island, and really one of the driving reasons that we're here today, essentially opening or acknowledging the creation of the Western River Refuge, which is a really incredible initiative, which was in the planning before the fires, but then this landscape, including where we are today, but not quite the green patch we're standing in, but all around us, was burnt in those fires. In the early part of those fires, which lasted for 2 or 3 weeks on Kangaroo Island, the fire went through here pretty early, and caused huge devastation to the natural environment here. Notwithstanding the fact we've just discussed that this landscape would have been burnt in the past, will be burnt in the future, and we need to acknowledge and be prepared and seek to understand that. But I guess the role of fire in a natural sense is inhibited because of human interaction with the landscape over generations has resulted in fragmented populations of particular creatures. And so where 100, 200, 300 years ago, a fire's impact from an ecological point of view wouldn't have been nearly so significant because there were thriving populations of many, many creatures. Today, those creatures are isolated in small envelopes of land, either in our reserve systems, private or public, or land that's under heritage agreement owned by private landowners, or just pieces of scrub that are out the back blocks of farms. There's a whole range of reasons where these creatures might have popped up, but of course they're much more impacted by fire, and that is one of the reasons we want to establish these sorts of refuges, and one of the reasons that Western River Refuge has come into being. Do you want to tell us a little bit about the background of how this place where we are today is now protected by a fence, and who were the driving forces behind making this happen?
Yeah, I think it's important to recognise that at the outset, Kangaroo Island is a very important place from a conservation point of view. So we had species like the Kangaroo Island dunnart, the Kangaroo Island echidna, the glossy black cockatoos, which are already pre-bushfires, in the 1920 bushfires, were already vulnerable, at-risk species. The population of the dunnarts, I think, was thought to be around 500. And they're very difficult to monitor and get an accurate density or accurate population number, but it was thought to be around 500, which is a very low number to start with. So we'd had a meeting with Kangaroo Island Land for Wildlife with Pat and Heidi in Adelaide in 2019, not long before the fires started. And they'd started presenting to us the idea of creating a fenced area on Kangaroo Island to try and secure the future of the species whilst broader landscape management could be figured out. How do we manage the impact of cats across the broader landscape? How do we manage weeds, phytophthora, the dieback disease, the landscape fragmentation? How do we manage those issues? And we're just starting to think through how we might approach a partnership when the fire started. And we all know the devastation that the fires caused through, particularly the western end of Kangaroo Island. Pat and Heidi had been working for a number of years with the local landholders, the Dobe family, and others across Kangaroo Island, researching and understanding the density and the population levels of things like the Kangaroo Island dunnart. And as soon as the fires went through, they jumped in helicopters to start to look for unburnt patches of land, and very quickly found on the Dobe property one of the very few patches of unburnt bush. And that's where we're standing today. And it's not going to come through in this talk, but the profound significance. It's almost a spiritual significance of how important this little patch of bush is to secure the future of species. When you look out across the horizon there, which means nothing to people in this interview, but I'm looking at burnt bush, less than half a kilometre away, where it was incinerated, where we know there was echidnas, we know there were dunards. Fires come through, destroyed them or made them more vulnerable to feral cats. And we can walk in here to this last unburnt patch of bush where we found populations of dunards, and we knew straight away we had to do something. We had to protect that last population.
And one of the miracles in this was that this was you were already looking at this site. So you'd already identified that the Dove family's property was one that was really worth being a potential partnership site. The Kangaroo Island Land for Wildlife organisation, the NGO based here in Kangaroo Island, had been working with the Dove family, and then the fires went through and we had this island of green in the midst of the Dove family's property was burnt as well. But I just think the value of this property, already a valuable property for conservation, went through the roof because it was this unburnt island of high quality vegetation in the midst of an area which we know had so much value.
Yeah, I mean, in many respects, the planets aligned. That we had the Dove family, who were committed conservationists to start with, had already been working with Kangaroo Island Land for Wildlife, and the relationship that we, Australian Wildlife Conservancy, had with Land for Wildlife as well, that enabled that very rapid deployment to get a fence constructed and then start understanding what we had within the fenced area and also how we might assist recovery outside of fenced areas. And it's really important to understand that the fence project is one thing in of itself, but it's speaking to a broader recovery for Kangaroo Island. In future years, it might become a place where we can take school kids out and start to educate them on the importance of conservation values. It's what it might mean to the community from an economic impact and an economic driver for the local community. And what it means to, once we can secure future populations of species, how do we start to translocate both in and out of the fence to really restore the ecological landscape across Kangaroo Island? So it's quite a profound project.
And the fence here at Western River, it fences an area of 369 hectares, and so that's a decent size. How much does a fence like that cost? And let's describe the fence as well, because it's I could try and describe the fence, but I'll let you describe the fence and then give us an idea of the cost of a fence like that.
Sure, we could do a whole podcast on fence construction and design, but I'm not sure how engaging that would be. So the cost of a fence has got a lot of variables built into it, and a lot of those come down to the topography that you're working within. Particular drivers are things like creek lines that you might have to cross, how you might need to manage high water flows. The design of the fence we're using here is really an evolution of what we've been using at AWC over the last 10 to 15 years. It's about 6 feet high. It's made of netting, a heavy grade version of netting that people might use in their chook pens. It's got 2 electric wires about halfway up with about 8,000 volts running through it, which is a nice wake-up call in the morning if you brush against it. It has a skirt that extends out on the ground at ground level for about 1.5 feet, and the aim of the skirt is rabbits will run up to the edge of the fence and try and dig, but they're not clever enough to realise if they just back up 0.5 foot or 2 feet, they can start digging. It's primarily designed to exclude cats and foxes though. And so the cat will come up to the fence and he'll try to climb the fence. He'll hit the 2 electric wires and with a bit of luck, he'll get booted off by them. If he's a sadomasochist and he gets past the electric wires, he'll then get caught up in what we call a floppy top. And the floppy top is a piece of the fence netting that extends and curves outwards from about 3 feet. And it's floppy, it's soft. So the cat will get tangled up inside this floppy top, dangle down, and with a bit of luck, he'll either hit the electric fence on the way back down and get thrown off, or he just won't like the fact that the fence is floppy and fall off anyway. So we've had that fence design in use for up to 15 years. We've never had a cat breach the fence, as far as we know. It's a very successful design. Other organisations are using a version of the design as well. And that's what we've got here for this critical refuge area, and then the greater 370 hectare fenced area. It's a very solid design.
And it's primarily trying to keep out the biggest predators that we've got here in Kangaroo Island for these small creatures are the cats. And are there foxes? I don't think there's foxes on Kangaroo Island. No, there's no foxes on Kangaroo Island. Someone off to the side is giving me advice on that. I should know that. There's no rabbits or foxes in Kangaroo Island. I did know that. Just making sure, when you're the Minister for Environment, you spend half your time thinking of all the feral things you need to deal with. Yep. So remembering which ones are where can be a bit tricky. Cats are the big ones. Cats and pigs, actually, on Kangaroo Island, although you're probably less concerned about pigs on this site in terms of the sort of conservation work you're doing. But pigs are also really destructive, and the fires have given us a unique opportunity to get on top of pigs as well. Yeah. But and one of the potential silver linings from the fires are projects like this that can deal with the pigs, but also deal with those feral cats, which are just so destructive, not just here on Kangaroo Island, but across the whole country.
Yeah, and I think it's important to understand, why did we build this fence? That we know feral cats are the main drivers of extinction of native animals in Australia. We know, based on the research that we've been doing, that cats are most effective in their hunting straight after a bushfire. And so the criticality of this fence here at the Western River Refuge was to stop the pressure of the feral cats on this very small remaining population of dunards, but also the Kangaroo Island echidnas and other species. So again, it's very difficult not to overstate how important this project is to secure the future of species like the Kangaroo Island dunnard, like the Kangaroo Island echidna, and a range of bird species at the same time.
It's a great project, and I am very grateful for the Australian Wildlife Conservancy, Kangaroo Island, Land for Wildlife, the Dobe family, and the various funding partners along the way who made this possible, because getting these sort of private land holdings protected and secured for our wildlife is so important. Tim, just before I wind up, I've got what we call our quick fire questions, and by quick, they can be a couple of sentences. I don't expect one word, but just a few things about the environment in your life. What's your favourite animal? Native animal, not a cat.
As the Chief Executive of Australian Wildlife Conservancy, I'm not sure I'm allowed to have a favourite, but look, I can't go past the numbat, to be honest. The numbat is a very, very cute animal, and I wish more Australians understood the numbat and what's so cute, ultimately, and pretty about the numbat. That's my favourite.
Well, hopefully some of our listeners are on Google Images now looking for cute numbats. Your favourite park in Australia?
Park or wildlife sanctuary?
Well, you can take your pick.
Sure. Look, there's a couple of places, but one of my early trips for Australian Wildlife Conservancy was to our Kalamurina Wildlife Sanctuary here in South Australia. So Kalamurina is 660,000 hectares on the north shore of Lake Eyre. And I had the opportunity to go and stand on one of the sand dunes, about 200 kilometres from the base, from the house, and to be able to have this opportunity to stand on top of a dune and have a 360-degree scan of the horizon and start to recognise and understand what was so important about protecting landscape at scale, to me, has stuck with me over the 10 years that I've been with AWC. So South Australia, Kalamurina Wildlife Sanctuary.
That's the right answer. We wanted one in South Australia. And the next question is, who do you think, in your personal assessment or in your personal life, has had the most impact in terms of South Australia's environment? I'm going to ask that one again. I said South Australia. We're doing national at the moment. Tim, who do you think is the person who's had the most impact on Australia's natural world or environment? Is there one person you could point to and say that person's really made a tangible difference to conservation in this nation?
Yeah, look, I can't go past Martin Copley, the founder of AWC, and he, along with a few others at the time, people like John Wamsley, a strong South Australian.
Yes.
But Martin kickstarted AWC, and he really set forth the vision of effective conservation, and that's our mission. That's a mission for AWC, is delivering effective conservation for all Australian native animals and the habitats in which they live. And we cherish Martin's legacy, and I'm forever grateful that I've got an opportunity to lead and be a part of an organisation like AWC.
which has made such a difference across the nation. Final question. This podcast is called The Best Time to Plant a Tree. And it's about that old saying that the best time to plant a tree was 20, 50, 100, 200 years ago, but the second best time is to plant it right now and get it going. What do you think our listeners can be doing? One piece of advice, one thing they can be doing for our environment right now that will set the natural world up for success into the future?
Get educated. Fundamentally, we've set a vision for AWC, which is to have an engaged population that values our biodiversity. And we need Australians to be educated about the numbat, the marla, 3 or 4 types of bettongs that we have, the various types of wallabies that we have, the phascogales. These are animals that the average Australian doesn't know exist.
People know about kangaroos and koalas.
That's right. But there's more out there than the koala and the kangaroo. And if I could ask anything, if I could encourage people, even if they have 30-second takeaway, is to jump on Google, as you said, look at pictures of a numbat and start to learn a little bit about their ecology. If we can start to build a bit of a groundswell of momentum around understanding the Australian biodiversity, we're in a good place.
Well, hopefully after this podcast, the numbat is trending on Google and various social media platforms. Tim Allard, Chief Executive of the Australian Wildlife Conservancy, thank you for joining me in this little green patch of Kangaroo Island today. It's been great talking to you.
Great, thanks very much.